On August 12th, 30 BC, the legions of Octavian marched into Alexandria. Egypt had fallen. Soldiers loyal to the future emperor stormed the royal tomb, where the last queen had barricaded herself. They expected to find a scene of desperation, perhaps even a struggle. But what they found looked more like a piece of silent theater. As the Romans stepped into the inner chamber, they found Cleopatra. She lay motionless on a golden couch, dressed in her full royal regalia, while at her feet 2 of her handmaidens lay dying. They found no signs of a struggle and no visible wounds, only 2 tiny, faint puncture marks on her arm. The official verdict, one that was certainly convenient for Rome, was that she had taken her own life using the venom of an asp, an Egyptian cobra. History's most famous suicide likely never happened, the way we were told. The Roman account, a venomous snake hidden in a basket of figs, is a poetic legend. But when faced with the facts, that story begins to crumble. Today we're going to show you that Cleopatra's death wasn't an act of desperation. It was her final, calculated triumph over the Roman Empire. Which leaves us with the ultimate question: what really happened inside that tomb? Let's start with the simplest detail: the snake. The Egyptian cobra isn't some small, harmless garden snake. It's a massive, powerful predator that can grow up to 2 meters long. Think about that for a second. 2 meters. That's taller than the average man. Common legend says she smuggled this 2-meter snake past the emperor's personal guard inside a basket of figs. No, we aren't talking about typical sentries at a gate. These were Rome's elite, the most suspicious, battle-hardened soldiers in the world. Their orders were clear: take Cleopatra alive at any cost. The idea that someone could slip an aggressive 2-meter reptile through a security cordon like that, simply by burying it under some fruit, sounds less like history and more like a bad joke. But even putting logic aside, there is one piece of evidence that changes everything: Cleopatra's own body. A cobra's venom isn't some gentle sedative. It triggers a slow, agonizing death that lasts for hours, marked by violent spasms, severe swelling, and the total distortion of the face. The body bloats, the skin darkens, and the features twist into an unrecognizable mask of pain. It is a full-scale biological revolt, not a quiet fading away. Now, contrast that with what the Romans actually found. When they discovered her, Cleopatra looked perfectly serene, like a sleeping statue. There were no signs of agony, no swelling. According to historical accounts, her beauty remained completely untouched. These 2 facts, the brutal reality of cobra venom and the peaceful state of the queen, simply cannot exist in the same universe. The official version of events isn't just unlikely, it is physically impossible. So why did Rome lie? Why was the story of the snake even necessary? The answer is simple: to cover up a massive failure. Octavian desperately needed to march Cleopatra through the streets of Rome in chains, a living trophy to showcase his absolute power. He didn't just want to defeat her, he wanted to humiliate her. Her death robbed Octavian of his greatest triumph, and it sent him into a blind rage. He lost. At the very last second, she snatched victory right out of his hands. Reports suggest Octavian even summoned snake charmers to try and suck the venom out to revive her. Not out of mercy, but to reclaim his prize. The official version has collapsed. This wasn't the suicide of a desperate woman. This was something else entirely. And to understand what really happened, we have to forget everything we thought we knew about Cleopatra herself. We need to start by shattering the most persistent myth of all, the myth of her beauty. The woman who brought Rome's 2 greatest generals to their knees wasn't a beauty in the Hollywood sense. We know this isn't just speculation. We have proof from the most reliable source imaginable: money. Surviving coins from that era depict a woman with a prominent, hooked nose, a strong chin, and a piercing, almost masculine gaze. This isn't the face of a seductress, it is the face of a CEO, a warrior, and a master strategist. Her power didn't lie in her looks, it lay in whatever it was that compelled those men to surrender to her will. So, who was she? Really? To understand her, we first have to dismantle a myth. Cleopatra wasn't actually Egyptian. Not even a drop. She was Greek, a pure-blooded descendant of the Ptolemaic dynasty. These were the successors of one of Alexander the Great's top generals. For generations, her family ruled Egypt as an occupying elite, holding the local culture and even the language in total contempt. But that isn't the most shocking part. For 300 years, her family married almost exclusively within their own ranks. Brothers wed sisters, uncles wed nieces, all in a relentless effort to keep their royal bloodline pure. 3 centuries of systematic inbreeding. According to every known law of genetics, this dynasty should have collapsed into a tragic parade of physical and mental deformities. For the most part, that's exactly how it was. Her siblings were weak and predictable, easily manipulated puppets. But despite centuries of relentless inbreeding, Cleopatra was born a genius. She was a genetic anomaly, a sudden glitch in a long history of biological decline. It was as if the collective intellect of a 300-year dynasty, instead of fading away, had suddenly condensed into one single person. And she wielded that intelligence with ruthless efficiency. She became the first and only ruler of her entire dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language. This wasn't just a knack for linguistics, it was a masterstroke of political branding. By speaking to her people directly without the filter of an interpreter, she became their queen, rather than just another Greek occupier. In total, she mastered 7 languages, with some accounts suggesting she was fluent in as many as 9. But even that was just the tip of the iceberg. Cleopatra was a practicing scientist. While other aristocrats spent their time in leisure, she was mastering complex scientific treatises in their original languages, diving deep into medicine, astronomy, and advanced mathematics. Evidence suggests she even authored her own scientific works, writing on everything from pharmacology to weights and measures and the chemical properties of poisons. She was a rare kind of leader, one who could negotiate international grain shipments in the morning, and by afternoon, debate number theory with Alexandria's greatest scholars or engineer a sophisticated medical compound. An intellect like that requires tools, and the arsenal she used to shape the world was as unconventional as it was brilliant. It spanned everything from chemistry and toxicology to the subtle art of mind control. She knew perfectly well that Egypt stood no chance against the Romans in a direct military conflict, not against their elite soldiers and their iron discipline. It wouldn't have been a war, it would have been a massacre. So she chose an asymmetric path. Her weapons weren't legions, they were words. The historian Plutarch, who interviewed people who had actually met the queen, noted that while her beauty wasn't flawless, her presence carried an irresistible force. This wasn't magic, it was a technology. Plutarch compared her voice to a multi-stringed instrument, and that's more than just a poetic metaphor. She mastered complex techniques of tone, rhythm, and pitch. In fact, these are the same high-level skills that intelligence agencies teach their top negotiators today. But her most potent weapon? Psychological calibration. She was a master at mirroring her audience. When she was with Julius Caesar, she presented herself as a scholar and a philosopher. Among the rank-and-file soldiers, she became a battle-hardened commander who spoke their language fluently. But with Mark Antony, a rough-edged soldier with a legendary appetite for wine and revelry, she transformed into the ultimate partner in crime. They would spend their nights roaming the streets of Alexandria, pulling pranks and chasing simple thrills. She didn't try to be everything to everyone. Instead, she became the one thing each man felt he was missing. Then she brought out the heavy artillery. This wasn't psychology anymore, it was pure chemistry. There is a famous account of a high-stakes bet she made with Antony. To prove her wealth and power, she took a massive pearl earring, a gem worth a literal fortune, dropped it into a goblet of vinegar, and watched it dissolve. Then she drank the entire mixture. History usually paints this as a moment of reckless vanity or madness. But this wasn't a whim. It was a calculated scientific demonstration. The chemical reaction between pearls, which are essentially calcium carbonate, and vinegar creates a substance called calcium acetate. In the ancient world, physicians prized this compound as a potent tonic. In reality, Cleopatra wasn't just performing a stunt. She was consuming a high-grade biosupplement right in front of her guests. Cleopatra frequently worked 18 to 20 hours a day. She governed a massive empire, navigated high-stakes diplomacy, and dedicated herself to scientific study. To keep her mind sharp under that kind of pressure, she needed every edge she could get. She was one of history's first true biohackers, a ruler who viewed her body as a precision instrument, no different from her mind. This wasn't just folk wisdom either. Deep beneath her palace, she maintained a fully functional scientific laboratory. This wasn't a workshop for alchemical hobbies. It was a serious research facility. And her experiments didn't stop at frogs or mice. Cleopatra tested various toxins on condemned prisoners, meticulously documenting their exact effects, their symptoms, and how long they took to work. Picture this. While her husband, Mark Antony, was unraveling, driven into a panic by false reports of her death, and spiraling through one fatal blunder after another, Cleopatra remained cold and composed. She was busy observing the effects of yet another toxin. She wasn't just looking for the deadliest poison. She was searching for the perfect one. She needed an exit that was painless and, most importantly to her, one that wouldn't distort her face. She was methodically curating her final appearance, keeping her posthumous image under total control. This wasn't just a test, it was the dress rehearsal for her final performance. But her most sophisticated weapon wasn't steel. It was scent. These weren't just perfumes. They were psychoactive compounds. Egypt's ultimate olfactory secret was kaifi, a complex blend of 16 different ingredients. It was a cocktail of honey, wine, juniper, and extracts from rare plants that could fundamentally alter a person's state of mind. It wasn't just a fragrance, it was a psychological tool designed to engineer a specific emotional state. When Cleopatra sailed her legendary barge toward Mark Antony, the incense from her ship drifted so far it reached the shore long before she did. This wasn't just for show. She was orchestrating a total sensory overload for him, weaving together music, low light, and above all, those thick, intoxicating aromas. She systematically built an artificial sanctuary, a chemical paradise that his brain simply refused to leave. This wasn't love. This was a carefully engineered chemical and psychological dependency. Now, with this entire arsenal in mind, we can finally return to her death. It wasn't an act of despair, it was her final and most flawless experiment. A masterfully calculated performance designed for two very different audiences. For the Romans, the narrative was clear. A defeated queen, refusing to be paraded in chains during her enemy's triumph, takes her own life. To them, it was simply the suicide of a desperate woman. But for her own people, the message was something else entirely. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the cobra was a sacred symbol of divine authority, the very image rulers wore upon their crowns. To an Egyptian, death by the bite of a sacred serpent wasn't an end. It was a direct descent to the gods, bypassing judgment and skipping every earthly formality. She staged her final exit like a grand theatrical production, a performance carefully crafted to be read in two very different ways. To the people of Egypt, it was a divine ascension. To the Romans, it was the desperate suicide of a broken woman. She lost the war on the battlefield, but she won the battle for the narrative, securing her own immortality. Cleopatra had mastered the art of bending the world's most powerful men to her will. But could she do the same to an entire civilization? When she arrived in Rome, she launched a campaign far more ambitious than anyone realized. A silent takeover of the enemy empire's very heart. She didn't arrive in Rome as a humble petitioner. She came as the representative of a far more advanced civilization. To grasp the scale of her arrival, we have to forget the Rome we know today. Back then, Alexandria was the world's scientific heart, the undisputed capital of human thought. Rome, by contrast, was essentially a massive military camp. Powerful, yes, but unrefined. Cleopatra didn't bring an army. She brought her brightest minds, astronomers, physicians, and architects, launching a quiet, intellectual invasion of the city. She didn't settle for an embassy. She moved directly into Caesar's private villa, transforming it into an unofficial cultural nerve center where the entire Roman elite flocked. Right away, she demonstrated the true power of her intellect. Before her arrival, the Roman calendar was a chaotic mess, lagging months behind the actual seasons. The Romans were living in one year, while the natural world was living in another. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a total systemic failure. To fix it, Cleopatra introduced Caesar to her own astronomer. He designed a solar calendar of 365 days, complete with leap years. That very system, with only minor adjustments, is the one we still use today. Every time you check the date, you are looking at the most enduring legacy of her journey to Rome. A fundamental part of your daily life, set in motion by her. But fixing the calendar was only the beginning. Cleopatra brought with her an idea far more toxic to Rome than any poison. She introduced Caesar to the Egyptian model of absolute power, a world where the ruler wasn't an elected official answerable to the Senate, but a living god. To the people of the Roman Republic, where the very word king was a slur, this was unthinkable. But the virus was already in the bloodstream. After his time with Cleopatra, Julius Caesar began acting like a monarch. He erected a golden statue of himself in the temple of Venus Genetrix and began demanding divine honors. He even started minting coins featuring his own face, something no living Roman had ever dared to do. For the senators, this was the breaking point. They assassinated him to save the Republic. But it was already too late. The idea proved far more resilient than the man, and far stronger than their daggers. This is the story's ultimate irony. Octavian Augustus, the man who defeated Cleopatra and her sworn enemy, had built his entire career fighting what he called Eastern tyranny. Yet in the end, he became Rome's very first emperor. He dismantled the Republic and replaced it with Cleopatra's own political model. Rome believed it had conquered Egypt, but in reality, Egypt had ideologically conquered Rome. Octavian didn't just win, he built an empire using her blueprints. But this transformation wasn't just happening at the top. While the elite were absorbing new political theories, everyday Romans were discovering something entirely different. The cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis exploded in popularity. Unlike the distant and rigid Roman deities, Isis offered something people desperately craved: personal salvation and the promise of an afterlife. Soon temples to Isis began appearing all over Rome. Even the height of fashion shifted. Noble women started mirroring Egyptian styles, from their intricate hairstyles to the very way they dressed. Cleopatra wasn't just watching from the sidelines, she was leading the charge. She went so far as to declare herself the earthly incarnation of the goddess Isis. To the Romans, who already viewed her as a bitter enemy, this was an act of unthinkable defiance. But for the thousands of new followers rising up in the heart of the enemy's capital, she was no longer just a foreign queen. She was becoming a living god. Cleopatra reshaped Rome, but she also left behind a much more personal legacy: a son. As the child of Julius Caesar, the boy represented a lethal threat to the new regime. The official record states he was executed. But just like the mystery surrounding her own death, the official version may be hiding one final secret. Let's be honest. Militarily, Egypt stood no chance. Cleopatra was playing a hand she was destined to lose. Her greatest enemy wasn't actually Octavian's legions, it was the genetic exhaustion of her own dynasty, the byproduct of 300 years of inbreeding. Her kingdom was depleted. Throughout her reign, Egypt was at the mercy of an unpredictable Nile. Constant droughts triggered famines, sent prices skyrocketing, and fueled civil unrest. She was presiding over an ancient, weary civilization. Rome, by contrast, was a young, aggressive superpower, an economic engine fueled by ambition and raw energy. She lost a battle that was, quite literally, impossible to win. But that was only the battle Rome saw. Her personal loss was even more devastating. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar shared a son, Caesarion, the living embodiment of two worlds joined together, and the rightful heir to both Rome and Egypt. To Octavian, this boy represented the ultimate threat, a walking challenge to his right to rule. Octavian is the man behind those famously cold, pragmatic words, "Too many Caesars." With that, he ordered the boy's execution. But this is where history begins to blur. Officially, the deed was done. Yet Caesarion's body was never recovered. No records of a burial site exist. This silence left a void that legends quickly filled. One theory suggests that Cleopatra, sensing the end, managed to smuggle her son out of the country. Some believe he was sent to India or Ethiopia, carrying vast treasures ensuring the bloodline of Caesar and Cleopatra never truly ended. We may never know the truth. Her biological legacy vanished, dissolving into the fabric of history, but her intellectual legacy, that was only just beginning. To see it for yourself, you have to travel to the most unexpected place imaginable, the very heart of its former enemy, a place that eventually became the center of the entire Western world, the Vatican. If you stand in the middle of St. Peter's Square, you'll find something that, at first glance, simply doesn't belong. Towering over the epicenter of the Christian faith is a massive Egyptian obelisk. This 4,000-year-old granite needle was originally carved to honor the pagan sun god, Ra. And its presence there is no accident. As Christianity rose to power, it didn't always destroy the ancient, beloved symbols of the people. Instead, it absorbed them. Look at these ancient Egyptian depictions of the goddess Isis cradling the infant god, Horus. Now compare them to early Christian icons of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The pose is identical, the gentle tilt of the head is the same. Even the core message remains unchanged. A divine mother and her sacred son. Countless statues of Isis escaped destruction. They were simply renamed, transformed into images of Christian saints. By proclaiming herself the living embodiment of Isis, Cleopatra, perhaps unknowingly, helped craft an image that would outlast her, outlast Rome, and eventually become a cornerstone of a brand new global religion. This was her true strategy. She wasn't trying to defeat Rome with military might. Instead, she was attempting what you might call a brain transplant, grafting the mind of ancient Egypt onto the body of Rome. She wanted to infect a young, powerful organism with a sophisticated, age-old idea, and her greatest rival, Octavian, became her primary instrument. After defeating Cleopatra, he didn't restore the Republic as he had promised. Instead, he claimed absolute power as the first emperor and began transforming Rome from a city of brick into one of marble, meticulously mimicking the grandeur of her Alexandria. Octavian thought he was building his own empire. In reality, he was following Cleopatra's blueprints. She lost the war, but she won civilization. Her legacy is woven into the very fabric of our daily lives, unseen, yet everywhere. Today, the entire world operates on a calendar built by her astronomers. Even the grand spectacle of a presidential inauguration is just a distant echo of the rituals of power she first helped shape in Rome. But her most breathtaking fingerprint stands in the harbor of a different city, on an entirely different continent. We see it so often that we've stopped noticing its true meaning. Back in the 19th century, French sculptor Frédéric Bartholdi was obsessed with a vision of immense scale. But he wasn't thinking about New York. He was designing a monumental statue for Egypt, a colossus meant to stand guard at the entrance of the newly finished Suez Canal. His original concept was titled, Egypt Carrying the Light to Asia. The design featured an Egyptian peasant woman in traditional robes, lifting a torch high into the sky. But the project hit a wall. The Egyptian government simply couldn't afford it. Years later, Bartholdi reimagined the entire idea and offered it to a young nation across the Atlantic, the United States. This is how an Egyptian peasant woman, bearing a torch, transformed into the Statue of Liberty. Yet, at her core, she remains the same. The goddess Isis, once embodied by Cleopatra herself, the goddess of wisdom and light, had finally crossed the ocean. Today, she stands in New York Harbor, greeting ships from every corner of the globe. In her hand, she carries that same flame, the torch first lit within the great library of Alexandria. Cleopatra lost the battle for an empire of stone, but she won the war for an empire of ideas, one that knows no borders and defies time itself. That light has traveled through the millennia, and it is shining still.